I'm going to be talking about the people side of accelerated innovation in this sort of digital transformation world we live in. And so, what questions I'm going to answer today? What makes a high-performance team? What skills do they need? Is the performance of a team based on the collective intelligence of the people in the team? Do they have skills aligned to the problem domain? How do we go about accelerating the innovation of a company by focusing on the people element? And I find nowadays, as we go through this journey of transforming our companies, we're not just transforming technology, we're transforming process, we're transforming the people, the culture, we're transforming everything at the same time. And so this presentation is a result of some research that I have done, looking into actual research papers based on various books I've read and assembled what makes up a high-performance team. In Red Hat, when we look at Red Hat, we believe that open unlocks the world's potential. By being open and transparent, sharing ideas and collaboration and making everything open, we're finding organizations are adopting these same principles and philosophies in terms of how they innovate within their organization. And we're driven by our people and our culture. So some organizations will come to me and say, look, how do we innovate through the open source way? And I'm on the advisory board for the federal government of Canada, and they're looking for help from us to look transform how the federal government innovates. And if you start with why, Simon Sinek is a thought leader. You start with why. As we build high-performance teams, what we need to do in this new world is create high trust. And trust is a distinctly human emotion. It's derived in the limbic part of our brains as a result of common sharing and values of beliefs. When we share and have the same values and beliefs, this thing called trust emerges. And this is an emotion that we need to have to trust people. And why that's important, as we transform our organizations, the culture and processes and technology, we need to experiment. It's part of the fundamental foundations of what DevOps is all about. In order to experiment, that inherently means there's going to be failure. And you got to make sure that people trust each other, that they're willing to take that experiment, learn from it, and move forward within the organization to progress the innovation. So I'll spend a little bit of time on DevOps because when we look at how we're reorganizing our companies through an agile, DevOps is kind of that new way that we're looking at how we innovate, and that's a huge impact to the people within the organization. The DevOps movement came out of several movements that all came together. The lean manufacturing movement of the 70s and 80s, where the Toyota Kata came out in terms of how we do lean manufacturing. The theory of constraints, the Toyota Kata, where you're always looking at continuous learning and improvement, in combination with the Agile software development movement of 2003, I guess, was when the Agile Manifesto came out. So these combinations of looking at IT, like in an assembly line, like a manufacturing line within the automotive industry, applying those lean manufacturing principles to that assembly line to make us faster and more agile. But a lot of the issues that we see in terms of how companies want to change how they innovate is on the people side, the culture side, not necessarily the process or the technology. And one of the things that we're trying to get around or fix or solve completely within our organizations, I think is summed up in terms of the core conic conflict that was put forward by Dr. Eli Yahu Goldratt, who was actually applying it to the lean manufacturing movement. It says, when you have two sets of groups within an organization that have diametrically opposing goals and incentives, you will not meet the mission of the company. You will not generate value for the end customer. And so when we look at IT in this context, we're talking about traditionally the DevOps, the dev movement, the developers, and the operations. On the development side, we're trying to make change fast or react to the market and develop new applications and bring new offers to the market. On the other hand, we got operations that want to make things predictable, stable, and they want to slow things down, right? So we got something that wants to move fast and something that wants to move slower. So we need to break that down, and DevOps is all around that. So I brought a book in today. The Devops Handbook is a great book, a how-to book on how to do DevOps. It's written by Gene Kim, who's a friend of mine. He's one of the forefathers of the DevOps revolution. Jez Humble, Patrick Dubois, who actually coined the term DevOps, and John Willis, who's an expert in CI and CD pipelines. In this book, they talk about these three core general principles. Gene Kim actually wrote the Phoenix Project, which is an easy read of talking about how do we go to the DevOps way. And these three core principles came out of both pieces of literature. first thing you see up there is fast flow. We're trying to go from the development to production. We want to maximize that flow. How do we do that? Number one, we get rid of handoffs, right? Wherever there's a handoff in the organization, from development to unit test to testing all the way through to pre-prod to production, you will form queues within your organization. That assembly line, and then DevOps speak, that technology value stream, you're trying to avoid handoffs because that's where you lose time. Things sit on in the queue, and if they're not addressed, it gets longer and longer, and that's where most of the time that we spend within our organizations, which is really waste in terms of how we innovate. So you're trying to avoid queues and handoffs. How do you do that? Well, you reassemble yourselves into smaller teams who look at across the whole spectrum. People have skills in development and operations and all the underlying skills from a development to operations technology value stream. You look at making the work visible. Everything we do in IT, for the most part, is invisible, right? It's not like a manufacturing line in a car plant where you see inventory building up or there's problems where something won't fit in. It has to be made visible. So the idea of Kanban boards, which are boards where you actually make the work visible, and you try to minimize the amount of work at any particular workstation in the technology value stream. There's a whole series of sub-principles that lead to fast flow, but those are the two main things. You're going to reorganize, you're going to make work visible, you're going to eliminate queues, and you're going to have cross-functional, cross-trained people within the chain. The second one is the feedback loops. What we do in IT is a highly hard-coupled sort of assembly line. Everything is attached to everything else. No one person understands the entire value stream from beginning to end. Like a developer doesn't understand ops, and ops doesn't understand development, if you will. So it's very hard. We build these systems that are very unpredictable. Sometimes in some systems I've seen, you put the same input to the system, you get different outcomes. So it's very unpredictable. So you need to create a safe system work at the cultural or the people layer on top of that to handle the situation that, the systems we build are inherently complicated and unpredictable. So feedback loops, learning to understand when there is a problem, scrum it, fix it, make it globally available, which feeds into the third principle, constant learning and experimentation. So once you get to a point where you're DevOps mature, you can start to make change very quickly within your environment. You can start to experiment with the market, right? You may want to change the offer if you have an e-commerce site in terms of your products and services or your digital experience. You may want to constantly change that, learn for how the market reacts, feed that back into your system so that you learn from it. So that's continuous learning and experimentation. So from a culture perspective, I did some research in terms of understanding, what kind of labels do we put on culture? How do we look at culture and define culture? And Dr. Robert Westrom did a lot of studying on in systems of people, in systems of culture to figure out, I guess the ultimate indicator of high performance, and that being if you measure performance on a life and death situation. He studied emergency rooms throughout the world, and he defined culture as being that organizational pattern in response to the problems and the opportunities within your organization. How does that organization respond to both those environments? And so that's the definition I'll go with as we study high-performance organizations. What he found was the organizations that had conscious inquiry, they were always questioning how they did things, they always learned from how they did things, was a key indicator of a high-performance culture. The second major piece of information he learned, or key marker for a high-performance, high-trust culture, was what he called the flow of information. And I don't mean information going from one part of the organization to another, from A to B. It's about getting the right information to the right person at the right time and making sure it's appropriate. So the organizations that can structure themselves and create a culture around making sure information gets to the right person at the right time are the high-performance culture, right? And what came out of that, not only is that an indicator of the output of that culture, but it also gives you a sense of typology, as he calls it, of culture. How do you categorize cultures within an organization? And so scenario A, a pathological culture where people are focused on the individual, right? They use information as a sword. It's an information to say, look, I got more power, and I'm going to grow my career within the organization. Information is not shared. It's kept within the individual. It's covered up when there's issues. Most of us, I think, fit in the middle scenario, which is bureaucratic, right? We're focused on groups. We're focused on information staying within the group, the mission of the group, as opposed to the generative culture. Excuse me. Grab some water. So the bureaucratic culture is focused on the group. The rules and policies of the company are for the group. They're trying to channel information within the group. It's not being shared outside the group. In the generative culture, we have a situation where the mission is well understood, people believe in the mission, they will avoid the normal channels to communicate and get the information to the right person, and they will reorganize themselves so information flows throughout the organization. And so generative cultures are the cultures that we're looking for. Dr. McChrystal talked about in his book around how we create teams of teams, and he goes from the hierarchical organization you see in your top left down to the bottom right, where you actually have teams that are teams of teams, and it's kind of like that DevOps kind of structure we're starting to see within organizations. But one thing you got to be aware of, Conway's Law. Conway, in 1967, got up in front and said, the way we organize ourselves and the structure of the communication between groups will be reflected in whatever system you design. So the classic example is, back in those times we built compilers. He says if you have 3 groups building a compiler, you'll get a three-phase compiler. If you got 4 groups building a compiler or a piece of software, you'll get a 4-phase compiler. You can see that with looking at DevOps, where we typically have distributed small teams. You'll end up with a software architecture that is distributed, it's loosely coupled, which is good. When things are loosely coupled, you can make changes to one part of the application without impacting the other. And so by structuring your organizations a certain way, you are effectively adjusting the structure of the system or the software architecture of that system. So there's a tight coupling there. So if you try to go against Conway's Law, you will have troubles. If people in one group decide to make a change, it may impact the other group's mandate within the organization and cause an outage. Versus most of us, I think, our legacy apps are at the bottom of the screen where you have these big monolithic applications, right? They're one big application. They have all the feature functions within that application, and making changes is hard. And that's why we're starting to see in the market distributed computing, where you see software architecture starting to be broken up into what we call microservices, or sometimes agile-based software architectures. We're starting to see that general movement within a lot of large enterprises. We need to break it up. That's why we have DevOps with small teams looking toward a microservice or a distributed architecture. Google looked at studying high-performance teams. They created a project called Project Aristotle, and the idea, they looked at 600 groups around the world, trying to identify and correlate what sort of makes a high-performance team, and they really struggled. They looked at all the data. They couldn't find any correlations. They didn't see correlations between the intelligence of the members of each part of the team, nor did they see alignment of the skills aligned to the problem domain, and they really struggled until they came across a paper in 2009. There was a paper issued by Carnegie Mellon in which they studied group collective intelligence, and it took psychologists and psychiatrists, a few hundred years to figure out maybe is there a thing such as collective intelligence of a group? We've always studied individual intelligences, not the collective intelligence of the group. And through that study, they found out that there was 3 factors that led to a high-performance group, being able to solve cognitive tasks very quickly. And one of them was the groups, how many members of the group were actively participating, solving problems together. If only 20% of the group talked versus 80% of the group talked, the 80% group, the more people that spoke within the group, the more likely they were to solve the problems effectively in a timely manner. The other thing was this thing called social empathy. So being able, the people within the group that could understand how the other people felt about their ideas within the group. If they were able to do that through testing, they found that led to a correlation to a high-performance team. So the Google people looked at that and said, look, I'm going to go back through all the data and figure it out. And sure enough, it came out. It was a result of these 5 factors that make up a high-performance team that you see here. And I've already talked about the psychological safety. People feel safe sharing their ideas, even before they're well thought out, with the rest of the team, and they solve problems much quicker, as well as the other aspects you see here: dependability, structure and clarity, meaning, and impact. Impact was a big one as well. So when you look at what I talked about, how we shape our organizations, how we organize ourselves, it produces this high-performance, high-trust culture. You look at the far extreme, open source is a prime example of that. There's 33 million open source people around the world innovating. And a lot of these teams, right, they're all around the world, they're spread out, they're highly distributed, they're all innovating together. So you get the raw capacity, the raw diversity of ideas all being thrown into this innovative model. And so organizations are starting to pick that up, enterprises saying, look, maybe we need to look at how we structure our organization to much more like an open source based model. Everything Red Hat does is open source, and so a lot of our largest customers on the planet said, how can you make us innovate the way you innovate, Red Hat, with our 11,000 people worldwide? And so our CEO, Jim Whitehurst, who wrote this book, The Open Organization, there's many tenets and principles he talks about in terms of how Red Hat actually operates to be shared with customers. And so we have a sort of an upside down, no longer a command control kind of hierarchy within the organization. A lot of decisions are made at the front lines in terms of how we innovate and bring new products to the market. And it's been very successful with organizations to look at how they need to organize themselves and maybe push down some of the ideas. One of the primary tenets of DevOps is to allow the frontline worker to get the data to understand how they're interacting with the product and the customer who's consuming the product at a very detailed level, and to make decisions on the fly and informing, obviously, leadership of what they're doing, but they're making decisions on the fly. So I got a customer like TELUS Digital, that anything you buy that's a consumer-based product from TELUS through the e-commerce site will go through one of our platforms, and they literally do 500 deploys a day to production. And what they're doing is transforming the offer they're making to the market, depending on who you are. If you're a millennial, you may want 2 options instead of 3 for a new phone. You may want different types of services. You may want to have different types of interactions. And so if you look at Amazon, which I guess is probably the highest deploys per day of any company on the planet, they're literally doing 15 million deploys throughout a year. And they're doing almost 250,000 deploys a day to production, literally experimenting with the market as they go and learning. And so what we're seeing as an example of this is with the federal government, they're taking the open source model and building their own communities. The BC Dev Exchange out on the West Coast have literally taken this to a next level where they say, let's build a community. Let's see who's passionate about working or innovating on a particular application, bring them together. Instead of the government just consuming things from open source, they're actually contributing back and actually learning the open source way. And so the bcdevexchange.org is literally producing problem statements through their website to the market, to the open source market, and they're saying, solve our problem. Rather than going to the market and saying, these are my requirements and this is what you need to do, they actually go into the market and say, this is the problem statement, and we want you to help fix it. And they actually have offered, through an agile procurement mechanism, upwards of $2 million in compensation to solve the problem. They call this Sprint with Us. This is the idea where, here's the problem, a DevOps team within the government of BC or outside of the government of BC can come in with a DevOps team, go through the iterations, and slowly build to solving the problem through a $2 million contract. Of course, you can extend beyond that, but that's the idea, right? Creating communities within the organization. The federal government in the US uses open source to take the tacit knowledge of all the people that are looking to retire and to build communities with some of the younger people so there can be a transfer of knowledge and a transfer of understanding of what they're doing. And a lot of this work has been done in terms of automating how they actually provision and go through the application lifecycle that I talked about earlier, from development to production, and building that into automation. So no longer allowing people to log into an asset like a server, a network device, or a public cloud and manually doing the operation. No, you write a recipe, you execute the recipe, and that does the work so that it can be repeated. So the knowledge comes out of the brain and goes into a system of record in terms of how the entire organization is actually operating. And I think we struggle, and I'm sure you probably struggle as well. How do you find these new people, these DevOps people, these agile people that think DevOps as opposed to waterfall? And we created an intern program many years ago where we actually have a 16-month on-site. We take 3rd and 4th year, typically university students, so University of Toronto, Waterloo, and a few other universities. Within the first 2 weeks, they sent a new hire orientation, and it's a focus on culture, the open source culture I just talked about. How do you participate, collaborate? What does meritocracy mean, right? Meritocracy is like best idea wins, no matter who you are. It's peer pressure. It came out of the ancient Athenians in ancient Greece, this idea of meritocracy, and that's how we run our business within Red Hat. The interns are treated like full-time employees. And I tell you, a lot of my customers and my partners are starting to look at not necessarily the skills and experience that you see on the resume. It's about finding the person with the right attitude and the right aptitude, right? These have to be smart, passionate people. They got to be aligned in the right spot. And it's amazing every year the quality of work that comes out of these internships within Red Hat with the younger people that we take into the internship. We feed them with opportunities to participate and build a sense of community. That's what we do at Red Hat the best, curate communities. And on completion, they're allowed to work on a project on an ongoing basis or join us full time. So we've been running this program for many years. I'd be happy to talk to you about how that program works, maybe after the presentation today. I'll be in the back room. And lastly, when we have an executive council within Red Hat, some of the biggest customers, some of the biggest enterprises on the planet, we ask them, what do you need from us? And they said, you need to teach us how to innovate the open source or the Red Hat way. And so we built out what's called the Open Innovation Labs, and we teach you this culture of open source and how we collaborate. How do you build high trust, high performance organizations? And we actually go through a residency, through a whole DevOps process to build a minimal viable product. Typically, it's a 2 times 2 week or 4 week sprint. We actually build a minimal viable product that is aligned with whatever you want to build within your organizations. So it's a residency. We take guys that when they think waterfall, they think of Niagara Falls as opposed to, develop an innovation process. These guys are all startups from Silicon Valley. They're brought on site when we go through a minimal viable product with you. We teach you the open source way. We teach you how to build communities, and we teach you how to innovate differently. We actually talk to you and figure out what tools do you want to use throughout this process. And we actually, once we have a selection of all the tool sets for a modern CI/CD pipeline, a DevOps kind of structured the tooling, we actually build that within less than an hour. And then we're up and running, and we're starting to build code and building a minimal viable product. So the Open Innovation Labs is an excellent way to change culture, change process, and invite people within your organization who are true change agents and want to learn how to do DevOps. So my last slide, call to action. Consider an Open Innovation Lab. Come see me. I can give you more details of how that works. Maybe just use it as a methodology or a model for how you want to go through this process of transformation. The Open Organization by Jim Whitehurst. The Devops Handbook by Gene Kim. It's on Amazon and some of the other electronic book resellers. Be happy to talk about that. It's a good read for you as well to understand this whole DevOps thing if you're new to it. And if you want to contact me, my LinkedIn and my media connections are there. And with that, I'll thank you. And I don't know how I'm doing on time, whether I can take questions, but got a few minutes? Perfect. Now, I went through that really fast. Was there any questions, things of interest that you would like to talk about? Oh, we have a question from Helen. I can repeat it.
What have you found to be the biggest hurdles with people adapting to DevOps? I mean, it seems so obvious, and yet it's really not really embraced fully yet.
Yeah, if I was to classify where we are in this journey as a nation, because I see it right across Canada, we're kind of at the early innovation stage of DevOps. Typically, organizations have a digital services team that are starting to formulate and starting to do things like TELUS Digital that I mentioned, or the BC Gov Dev Exchange, or the federal government has a digital service, the Ontario government from public sector have a digital service. Some of the major hurdles which are talked about in the book, I don't get paid for the book, but I'm telling you, number one, the banks learned this early on down in the US. If you're going to create transformation within your organization, and one of the first barriers you come across is the institutional memory that's built up. All the way we think about why things are done a certain way. You have to extract this new DevOps team into their own working facility, away from everybody else, and let them innovate through this new DevOps methodology. So number one, the extraction of the services, digital services team, or the DevOps team, or the Agile team, away from the central larger organization is critical. Number two, you got to give them the right tooling that enables this. Number three, I think it's really hard to do this by reading a book. You have to actually have some sort of mentorship involved in this, because I find when we go through these Open Innovation Labs, particularly in Canada, the philosophies of how we innovate are much different in this, and the people within your organization typically don't understand what those other opportunities are and the way they should look at the world. There are different perspectives. on how they look at things like compliance and audit and things that sort of hold us back in security. You'll find if you're not involving, there's this new movement within DevOps around, we're calling it sort of DevSecOps now, where security is a continuous thing that has to happen all the time. Compliance is a similar thing. You do security throughout the entire life cycle of the DevOps process of innovation. And you got to have buy-in, I think, with the business. Ideally, and I'm hearing from talking to people here today, a lot of people do have the business in these small teams that I talked about earlier. The business has to come in with a business hypothesis, right? The DevOps team typically turn it into code and get it to production right away. And when you're thinking DevOps, you're thinking same day kind of deployments, right? You have a whole list of feature functions you want in the application. The business guy is saying, yeah, if I offer this to this particular type of market segment, I think I'll get some traction, right? And the application guys say, okay, I got that. I'm going to code it. We're going to throw it in production and see. I guess the other element is you got to have all the data. You got to get the data in terms of how does that impact? How does the digital experience of the consumer of your service, how's that going? Are they buying products? How are they navigating the page? I have one customer that gathers over 800,000 different metrics. 800,000 different metrics. Now, of course, they don't use them all, but when they need them, they're there and they can go deep. But having the business in that team, giving the business hypothesis, and in agile speak, we call them user stories. You know, as a person goes through an application, through a website, or through, navigate through their phone to buy something. Getting those user stories and making them a priority and getting the business involved is another major thing that you need to think about. So this really is bringing together all the skills and capabilities of a company together. The last thing I will tell you, organizations that create a new central digital hub of innovation where a lot of the innovation happens, a centralized platform, are successful rather than having different types of platforms all over the place. So in general, as a strategist, that's what I do. The old days of doing a 3 to 5 year plan and then executing the plan and taking market share and getting to where you want the company to go, those days are gone. Companies are investing in two things, a centralized platform of innovation and creating an agile DevOps kind of capabilities within the organization. So those are some of the key points I would say.